Marybeth Baluyot is not your inspiration porn. We couldn't put that word in the title, but it is nonetheless a strong component of her media presence. I mean, it's one of her strongest components anyway. She has many different hats she wears in the world of competitive strength sports. The woman is a competitive powerlifter, occasional Olympic weightlifter, and the co-founder of the Disabled Girls Who Lift podcast. Marybeth is a strong advocate for more inclusivity in strength sports, inclusivity of racial minorities, for disabled athletes, for transgender athletes, and so on. And her love of strength comes from a really true, genuine love of self-empowerment and self-improvement, which you're going to see in our interview today. Growing up, soccer seemed like a natural fit for Marybeth, given she was born with only one hand.
I, was navigating around that first until I got into a lot more self-development, self-empowerment, and finding strength as a disabled woman of color who is very, very small, who can, squat or lift something 2 to 3 times her body weight. I found that beautiful empowerment through strength training, especially powerlifting.
And it was at UC Berkeley, where she now works full-time, where she first picked up barbell training.
So yeah, of course, I delved into the squat first because it was much easier to navigate since there were very few or little to no disabled athletes in powerlifting that I knew of 6-7 years ago. So it was a beautiful way to kind of find that power back as, like I said, an adaptive athlete, a woman especially, since strength training at the time had not had very many of us to represent. So it was beautiful in training to see that type of excitement for someone who looks like me, and then to see it again on the platform in these major competitions at nationals. Everybody who didn't know you still cheered for you, regardless of your circumstance. So
you sort of mean about her passion for strength. In fact, her best squat and deadlift are 302 pounds each, which is about 2.5 times her body weight, which is a very impressive strength to body weight ratio. And while when she first started out, her lifting focused mostly on squats and unilateral exercises, she soon realized that even though you do see a lot of trainers and athletes lifting with one arm as like a gag on Instagram, it's actually not the best thing for a well-rounded physique, well-rounded strength, and for injury resistance.
I found that lifting single-handedly was not good for my body, for my form, and it wasn't a way for me to, level the playing field. Having the highest total is really important. After playing around with some tools, some accessible lifting tools, I like to call them, or other straps and contraptions that I put together with my coach, I found a better way to deadlift.
The creation of her lifting hook is one of the key moments in her lifting career, not just because it brought bilateral barbell training to her programming, which by the way looks pretty much the same as any standard programming, but because she ran up against real institutional resistance to it. Marybeth found out that she was not able to use this hook when she was lifting in the USAPL. USPA and WRPF were fine with it, but she would not be able to compete on the platform at the USAPL with her lifting hook.
Well, USPA I have loved ever since they allowed me to use my lifting hook in competition. That's a huge step for a powerlifting federation who is not very used to seeing these types of tools. There's a list of equipment that's allowed, specific brands that are allowed, and I know how important that is to federations. But this idea of inclusivity and looking into the conversation further, this idea of looking at us athletes in a bigger picture and creating that, allowing us to lift in that platform, I really enjoyed in USPA. So the United States Powerlifting Association, after having spoken to them about my situation and other adaptive athlete situations, they were actually able to include in their rule book their inclusivity for adaptive athletes. If there's any device that you use, they would look into it and talk about it further rather than deny it. So I've been happy with their susceptibility to that.
So she's had some issues with the USAPL, although she's had great experiences with the USPA, and also USAW, USA Weightlifting. Their CEO, Phil Andrews, allowed her to snatch and clean and jerk on the platform, no questions asked. So when I asked Marybeth what her biggest obstacle in strength sports was, this is her answer.
It's a very simple request, right? It's actually a very huge request that's happening right now, especially with Black Lives Matter. And, true inclusivity, and not necessarily, posting a picture of your one Black or disabled or brown athlete, but working hard internally to change your rule books to make more inclusive committees. I saw that USA Weightlifting actually had posted their Black athlete scholarship, which is a huge move for any barbell sport federation. I think I'd love to see a lot more of that in USA Powerlifting and USPA and others that athletes like us pay a lot of money to already. And if we see some of those federations give back to those who are not represented as much in these federations, I think that would be great to see as far as action items.
And then there's a question of whether or not federations should consider separate athlete categories for adaptive athletes or transgender athletes.
A huge obstacle that I've faced was, even after all these conversations with USAPL, there's this great idea that they're having internally of creating separate, not necessarily weight classes, but separate categories within a federation, right? So you would compete as a male or a female, then you would compete as under your body weight category. They are thinking of creating a class for adaptive athletes that are separate. And some have talked about creating one for trans athletes. But I think what we're trying to do is make it more inclusive and allowing us to compete with everyone else, if that's what our preferred choice is. Because of course, trans women are women, trans men are men, same way that adaptive athletes are athletes. So I'd love to see a lot more of that intentional inclusivity.
We mentioned tokenism earlier, the way that many gyms and athletes and federations will put their minority athletes front and center on all of their marketing materials to show how open and inclusive they are, or the way that journalists will often title articles about these sorts of athletes. And Marybeth used the word cringeworthy more than once. The intentions may be noble, but the way that minority athletes are held up and used as inspiration porn tends to other them as a result. In trying to make them able to inspire you, you're not really putting them on the same level as other athletes.
One, there's this presumption about ability and the idea that people who are disabled do not have an ability to live a normal life, to perform these daily tasks, to have a job, to have long-lasting relationships, healthy relationships, be an athlete. So the idea behind the shirt, and a lot of what we talk about in our podcast with Marcy and Chloe, is that you should remove these presumptions, first of all, about people with disabilities, because we have existed for a long time. We are the biggest minority in the world, the biggest minority in the US, and remove that awe and amazement of how we perform our daily tasks, and really question what your perception of inspiration is. What does that word truly mean to you before you use it to describe an adaptive athlete or a fat athlete who had either lost 100 pounds or lost 5 pounds? How are we actually inspiring you? And then how are you separating yourself from our otherness? And then are you centering your able body? Are you centering your skinny body and considering yourself the image to look up to? And then looking at us and saying, well, if they can do it, then I can do it because I'm more normal. Or am I, as an adaptive athlete, inspiring another person with a disability to do what it is that I thought that I'd never could do before? The word inspiration is already a very cringe-worthy word, I think, for the disabled community and the fat athlete community as well. There are things that you notice in the tone in these titles and these articles, and that, wow, a woman with one arm performing daily tasks. I'm like, wait, where's the wow in that? Wow, a one-legged athlete performing the deadlift. Like, yes, this is a very incredible feat, but let's dive deeper, right? Let's look at how much she had worked her entire life. Let's look at other ways that she is excelling in the sport. rather than just focusing on the person's disability. Or just saying my name. Call me by my full name. My name is Marybeth Baluyot. Don't call me a one-armed athlete, because we see that a lot where we are removing names from people's identities, you know, keeping them in this box that I'm only allowed to be a one-armed athlete in powerlifting. I'm not allowed to be all these other identities, which is queer, which is pansexual, which is polyamorous, which is a disabled immigrant. Like, everything defines me, not just the one box that you see me as.
As an able-bodied straight white dude who works in media and has probably broken these rules in the past, I found this conversation really instructive, and it's really going to help me to better shape the conversations I have about minority athletes in the future, and hopefully it'll help you do the same thing. I really want to thank Marybeth Baluyot for coming on the channel today. That's it. That's everything today. If you like her, you should check out her podcast that she has with Marcy and Chloe called Disabled Girls Who Lift. And she also sells those t-shirts as well, if you like those too. Make sure you subscribe here as well at BarBend, because we've got plenty more fitness and nutrition videos and athlete interviews coming up.